Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast.
Welcome to another episode of Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. We're your hosts, Jeremiah
and Thomas.
We hope you enjoyed our last episode, and we hope that you'll enjoy the content that we bring to this episode just as much. All right, today we'd like to talk about families.
Families. So whenever we got into the sport, right, we would be sitting there watching the race, and we would hear these names that were, I think, iconic to everyone else in the Formula One world, but maybe not so much to us just because we didn't know.
No, as we were taking the time to learn the nowadays drivers, the guys who are on the grid right now, we thought it was important for us to also take a look back and look at the past drivers. And upon doing so, we actually learned that there are several family members who are drivers today who have ties from back then.
It's crazy. I mean, that's like most sports in the world. You have like these family connections, but I think it's crazy that you have 10 to 15 close family connections in F1 that is a sport that only has 20 drivers on the grid, plus or minus a few given the season. But there's a short history of F1, and there's not that many drivers, and there's a lot of families.
Okay. Give me your top families for F1.
Okay, let's go back and forth on this. Let's say top four. I'm going to go with the Rosbergs.
Ooh, Kiki and Nico.
Okay, here's why. Kiki wins a championship in 1982. Pretty impressive. He had an 8 to 10 year run where he did really, really well and then won in the 82 season. And then you have his son, Nico. What is he famous for?
Equal machinery.
And beating Sir Lewis Hamilton in that Mercedes in equal machinery.
I don't think his dad did the same.
No, I don't think Kiki can claim beating Lewis Hamilton in equal machinery. But no, I mean, a great family name, and obviously Nico wins in 2016 and then leaves the sport and goes into broadcasting, and honestly, nothing could be better than his commentaries on race day.
No. Okay, I got one for you.
Shoot.
The Hills.
The Hills, a little more old school.
We're talking Graham and we're talking Damon.
Interesting.
So Graham's got two of them. I don't know if you know this. He won back in 1962 and 1968.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then as soon as his son gets into the sport, you know, he's had some very competitive years. He had 1 year where he was third, the next year second, and then here we land in 1996, World Championship.
I heard Jeremiah researching the Hills for this show, and he was sitting over there running down the list of their racing records, and he goes, second, third, first, third, second.
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. These guys, I don't know if they just spent a lot of time together, but Graham definitely taught Damon a thing or two.
Yeah, so we've got the Rosbergs in the Hills. Rosbergs, obviously, 80s, and then now into the teens of the 2000s, and your Hills were 60s and 90s,
yes,
right? So a little bit old school there. Let's talk maybe a little more current day. Let me throw at you the Verstappens.
Mr. Jos Verstappen and his son Max.
Okay, as we do more of these shows, I think everyone will come to find that I am a huge Max Verstappen fan. One, what a cool name, Verstappen. Two, he's got an awesome logo. I don't know if you've seen the M and the V thing, but it's pretty awesome. And then finally, he's got the Dutch connection, and there's something about the Netherlands that I've always loved, their bright orange colors and all that craziness that they have during the Olympics. But you have Jos Verstappen, who had a karting career and an F1 career, just like Max did. He didn't have the level of dominance that a lot of F1 drivers... Well, not a lot. Let me tell you that. He didn't have a lot of dominance in F1, but he was a pretty average driver. But what he did was he got into the sport and raised his family on it.
No, absolutely. I feel like, you know, obviously if you're going to get into F1, then you're going to care a lot about your career. You're going to put a lot of time and effort into it. But once you reach a certain year where you're starting to get up there in age and you're realizing you're not going to get that championship or anything like that, I think he started to really give all of his time to his son, Max, and get him into karting early, teach him everything that he knows, obviously probably help with the financing along the way, the connections from his past racing career.
Just like with anything, I think with karting and histories like that. So Max got into karting at what, age 3 or 4, right?
It was about, I think 4.
So obviously Jos and the Verstappen family knew that was the way to get their son to F1 the fastest way possible, right? Put him in the sport. And then, like you mentioned, because Jos was in F1, maybe he wasn't great, but you still have the connections. You've got the phone numbers. You've got the emails. You know who to call when you need some money.
Right. Unfortunately, I think we both know that Jos Verstappen's claim to fame in terms of his F1 career has got to be that pit stop where he drove off with the fuel line still connected and his car set fire. Yeah, that's the reason why they don't do refilling. I don't know if you know that.
I didn't know that was a him thing.
Yeah, so they made that rule where people aren't refilling during pit stops in the middle of a race because of his car catching fire.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think when we first started watching Drive to Survive, we were like, oh, these pit stops are incredible. And then we went back and watched some old race footage and we're like, why are these pit stops taking like
20
minutes. Seconds?
20 seconds.
Well, yeah, but they were refilling the car, which, we're used to in NASCAR, but we hadn't seen that in F1 until we watched like historical races. But obviously, Jos brings up his family greatness, and now he has Max, who is a 2-time world champion, which, let me clarify, on this podcast, we will not be debating the 2021 world championship.
We're definitely going to debate the 2021 championship.
He was the clear winner. He beat Lewis fair and square. I don't care what you say about the FIA and Michael Massey. It is what it is. And that's what happened.
We'll get into that later.
All right. Who's your last big name?
All right. The Schumachers. So we've got 7-time world champion Michael Schumacher. Clearly one of the greatest of all time, if not the greatest of all time. And his son, a former Haas driver by the name of Mick Schumacher.
Ah, yes. The Haas Uralkali driver.
Fun fact about Mick, I don't know if you knew this. To kind of avoid his last name when he was in karting, he actually went by a pseudonym.
Do you know what it was?
I don't remember the exact name. I do remember that it was his mother's maiden name.
Interesting.
So he went off of Mick and then his mother's maiden name, which I believe was like Brack or something like that. Don't quote me on that.
So was he trying to avoid like the whole legacy?
He was. So he was trying to get away from the connection to Schumacher because he wanted to get it on his own. He wanted everybody to see his style, see his abilities on his own for him, and then find out, oh, he's the son of 7-time world champion Michael Schumacher.
I like that. We'll talk about this here in a second, but there's a thing with legacies and greatness and all that, and the fact that somebody was purposely trying to kind of avoid it, and it still worked out pretty well, is a really good sign.
So I'm going to go ahead and dub the Schumachers the Europe racing family.
The Europe, yeah. Europe, definitely Germany's racing family.
100%.
Michael had 7 championships, right?
Yes, 7 championships. And then Mick, obviously none yet, but we shall see.
None yet, and he doesn't have a race seat for 2023.
Hang on. He is a reserve driver for Mercedes.
He doesn't have a seat.
But Mercedes does have that contract with McLaren where they offer engines, and because of that they also share reserve drivers. So while it could have a Lewis or George that goes out and Mick fill that seat, or we could have a Lando or Piastri and Mick fill that seat as well.
I think Mick got his seat too soon and he didn't have enough car experience, but I do think he could be a really good driver, at least if he has a good team around him, and I don't know if Haas was quite ready to step up into a midfield team yet.
No, the problem is that Mick, if you look at his track record, he's always had a struggling time for the first year while he's figuring everything out, but then the next few years he starts to build and build and build until he is dominant. Well, maybe not dominant, but one of the better racers.
Yeah.
So to get into F1 and your first team be a backmarker Haas team that can't keep up with the 9th place team right above them.
Yeah. We started watching Drive to Survive, and the first season, the 2017 season, was very Haas focused. And I think that was smart because in the background you would just hear, and Lewis Hamilton wins again, and it's like, okay, that it wasn't a cool storyline because it was the known thing. The cool storyline were the teams that were really trying to get back to or get to greatness for the first time. Like the same thing with Williams. Williams is a great team, and then Haas is now entering the sport and wants to be great. And I think in that first season, they mentioned how they wanted to be a mid to upper tier team, and it has just gone backwards ever since.
Dude, it started out so hot with that first race where you had Kevin Magnussen and Roman Grosjean both qualifying in the top 10.
Yep.
And then those pit stops that took them out of it.
Okay, so you've got the Schumachers as Europe and definitely Germany's racing family. Meet America's racing family. The Andrettis.
Oh.
Another awesome name, by the way,
Yes.
in racing. What was that guy's name? Scott Speed.
Yeah.
It's not a name quite like that, but it just has that sound to it that fits a racer. So there are multiple Andrettis, but the only ones that really carry weight in the Formula world are going to be Mario and his son Michael. Mario wins the 78 F1 championship. But on top of that, he's also done stock car, NASCAR, open wheel racing, IndyCar. He's done the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 4 different decades.
Wow.
He hasn't won it, but he got second.
But let's talk about the fact that he's won almost all of the other ones that you've
Yeah.
named.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been a champion in all walks and forms of motorsport racing.
In terms of pure worldwide auto racing, he might be the best driver ever just because he's covered everything. So not only do you make it into each of those sports, but you're good enough to compete with the best and win those sports as well. Schumacher, Michael especially, wins 7 world titles in Formula One, makes him the best or one of the best F1 drivers of all time. But you don't have that kind of every other sport that Andretti did.
Right. And, maybe if Mario Andretti had spent all of his time just focusing on F1,
Yeah.
he maybe could have matched those titles. Maybe not. That's a very high number.
I think it's like one of those things where he's the type of guy where once he masters or perfects something, it's on to the next challenge.
And, more power to him.
And so you have Michael, who didn't have quite the racing legacy that his father did, but something that they've done together is really build up the Andretti brand, which is something I think the Schumachers should work on, is just a worldwide racing brand. But when you look at Andretti, you have Andretti Racing, you have in the States Andretti karting facilities, you have their recent discussions trying to enter the F1 grid as their own team and constructor.
Which I am very excited about.
It would be really, really cool if we could have Andretti and Audi and Porsche and Ford all enter the sport.
Well, Andretti actually has been in talks with Cadillac.
Oh, I saw that.
And I think that that's the one that they're going to link with.
What did I text you that day? They're just going to line a Cadillac CTS-V up on the grid. Pure American muscle at all 300 horsepower or whatever it has.
So the Andrettis are fun. I understand. But there's another side of the Schumacher family.
Oh, no.
So we've got Michael's brother, Ralph,
Yeah.
who F1 driver, maybe not as successlonger, but still had a crazy good career.
So we're talking more average families.
Yeah, definitely average. We're no longer talking about dynasties. We're no longer talking about legacies. Ralph Schumacher, yes, that same Schumacher name, but not as successful as his brother Michael. And then his son.
Just really downgrading that whole man's family. He was an
still-
F1 driver.
You have to understand that they had 3 drivers as F1 drivers in that family. That's crazy alone. You can't take that away from them. Now, he does have a son, David Schumacher, who's currently in F3 and working his way up. But if he does get to F1, we're talking 4 family members in Formula One.
Yeah, and that probably makes them... They probably already are the most, dominant family just with Michael Schumacher. But the fact now that you're adding in other characters to that, it expands on their greatness. Let me throw another averagey one at you. The Magnusons.
All
as
right.
as we return to the Haas discussion. You've got K-Mag, obviously, and Jan Magnussen. Both were pure dominant in the karting world. And I'm talking the European karting championship, the German karting championship, and the World karting championship. Neither had a over-the-top F1 career, but they made it, and they were F1 drivers, and they hold that name. Let's talk maybe about some of the families that had really, really great older generations that got spoiled.
Ooh, from greatness to gone completely.
And I hate doing this because when you talk about the ones that were great, their career should stand on their own, and they do. But because we're talking families, we have to talk about the whole family. You can't just leave that family out at the Thanksgiving dinner. The PKs. The Brazilian father and son duo.
Ah, yes. Nelson and Nelson.
Yeah, Nelson squared. So Nelson Piquet, senior, 3-time Formula One champion, which, obviously boosts you up to the top tiers in terms of Hall of Fame and legacy with Formula One drivers. He leaves the sport. His son, Nelson Piquet, comes in the 2000s, 2010 to 2012, I think, or 2009, sorry, and he has the 2009 crash gate.
Ah, the Crashgate scandal. Did he wreck on purpose?
Yeah, so this was before our time in the sport, obviously. But learning about Nelson Piquet, I saw his name first in NASCAR, and I thought Nelson Piquet Jr. was just a NASCAR guy. He's got this Formula One history. 2009, he crashes his car during a race to help his teammate, I believe Fernando Alonso,
Yes.
move up and benefit in that race. He comes out and says, no, it's just an accident. And then they go to court and trial, and then it's all redacted. And
Yeah,
then
you're forgetting the word allegedly.
allegedly, but it's kind of all come out that essentially he did it on purpose to benefit his team. We've seen this recently. Do you remember last season when Yuki Tsunoda stopped on the track in the Netherlands?
Yes, and everybody thought that was for the benefit of Red Bull.
Right, because remember, he said, I have a problem with my car. He came in, they said, no, you're good, and they sent him back out there, and he just stops on the side of the track.
Yeah,
He's
he
like,
just pulls over. No, nothing's working right.
He said, my tires are loose, my seat belts are loose, and he just stops. This was that, but times 100, because he purposely crashed the wall, had a big implication on the race. So much so that after all of the F1 or FIA discussions, he gets suspended and he leaves the sport, and that's when he goes to NASCAR.
All right, so following on this same topic, let me throw one at you.
Go for it.
The Sennas.
Ah, yes, Ayrton Senna.
So Ayrton, as we all know, was one of the best drivers to ever drive.
Yep.
Up until, unfortunately, the crash that took him out of the sport completely.
Ties back to how wild this sport is that you have a guy that is having
Untouchable, dominant.
I mean, he would be on the same tier as Michael Schumacher today.
I mean, he walked around and you would have thought that this man was invincible.
Yeah, but they are going 200 plus miles an hour in cars that weigh next to nothing.
And we're talking about before all the safety changes.
And they're all the ultimate competitors that if you listen to the drivers now, they say that they are only getting in that car to win and they're taking nothing off.
So Ayrton Senna, one of the greatest of all time, has a nephew, Bruce Senna.
Mm.
Do you know anything about Bruce Senna?
I really don't. But to point out, we're out of the father and son duo and now on to uncle and nephew.
So that is true. Yes, they are uncle and nephew, obviously, instead of...
So we can remove them from this whole conversation if we don't want to talk Bruce.
There's nothing really much to talk about. It's like you said, you don't know anything about it. It's because there's not really anything to know.
Yeah.
It was kind of an unfortunate career. Definitely not living up to the Senna name. He's one of those where you kind of question... did he get his seat because of the last name or did he earn it? And you hate to say that because it's such a tight-knit group. There's only so many people that can get in. So when one gets in off of a name or off of money or something like that, it almost feels tainted. But
yeah. So you make a good point that a driver can get a seat for a number of reasons. You would like to think that all 20 drivers on the grid are there because they are dominant formula style racers, right? But it's not always the case, and this will be a brief tangent that ties into families, but maybe not formula families, but money families.
oh yeah.
So there's a thing called pay drivers in the F1 world, and pay drivers are essentially where you have a family member with a lot of money that is able to fund your career, have a company, be a sponsor for a car, and get you a seat in return for that car.
And just to give you kind of a couple examples of that, we can talk about Lance Stroll and his father, Lawrence Stroll, who made a giant donation to Williams, but at a cost. And that cost would be to let his son, who doesn't deserve an F1 spot, to drive for Williams. From Williams, I believe he moves to Racing Point.
Yep.
And then Racing Point gets bought
out
out by Aston Martin.
Lawrence Stroll.
Lawrence Stroll actually goes with Aston Martin in on this project, so he is a part owner in this company.
So Lance Stroll, and we'll get to some others in a second, but Lance Stroll, is he a good racing driver? Yes. Should he have a Formula One seat? Probably not. I would argue against it because he just hasn't performed in that car.
Well, see, it's weird because when he first started, I would have said no 100%. This is kind of where you and I differ a little bit, is I feel like in these years that he's been there, he's just now starting to get where he looks like he belongs. I still wouldn't say that he should have had that seat from the jump and he shouldn't be in, period. But
no, so he's got Lawrence Stroll, who's funny. Okay, one of my all-time favorite cars is Aston Martin. I love everything Aston Martin's ever rolled out, and I'm talking like personal cars here. It's the James Bond car. It's just cool. Every Aston Martin car is hand signed from the guy in the factory in England that built the thing. Nothing would make me happier for them to be a really good F1 team, but as long as Lawrence Stroll owns them and Lance Stroll's driving for them, they're not going to win.
Yeah, we'll have to see what Fernando Alonso does over there now.
I know, and he's so
replacing
good,
Sebastian
and I'm
Vettel.
hopeful that he helps, but I just don't like the fact that he bought his way into the seat and isn't performing. It would be a different thing if he was the champion. It'd be a completely different story.
Oh, yeah.
There's another one that served on the grid in last year, but is not returning in 2023 as far as we know. Nicholas Latifi.
Yes.
Who caught some slight slanders and foul balls in the first episode.
I believe you mean Goat Tiffy.
Nicholas Goatifi, at least he had something go viral for him because it wasn't his performances. His father owns the company Sofina, who was plastered all over the side and back of the Williams car. But essentially the same deal as the Strolls. His father funded his career, which is great. It allows your kid to get into sport and be good at it. But the problem with that is they never have to finish in the top 3 of the F1 feeder series to get that F1 seat like everyone else does. They get to say, I'm either going to buy this team or sponsor your team with millions of dollars, and in return, you give my son the seat.
Right, and unfortunately, with Nicholas Latifi's case, he is going to be best known as 2 things: a paid driver and the one that hand-delivered the championship to Max in 2021.
I don't know about that. I will say Max earned that all on his own.
Right.
With some marginal help from Sergio.
Right after that safety car.
And the mild rule changes and all that. But I did find it interesting when, is it Jost Capito, the new, relatively new principal of Williams?
The one that took...
When he was interviewed, and this was before kind of when they were announcing that Latifi was going to go, but slightly before that, they were like, do you still need his money to run your team? And he said, no, we don't need that sponsorship anymore. And a couple weeks later, he's gone. I love that they're making moves like that at Williams. They are committed to winning 100%.
Oh, they were committed to winning the second they signed Logan Sargent, the greatest driver to ever exist.
Possibly the greatest driver to ever exist. I think the other thing when you're looking at F1 families, again, I mentioned it, it's in every sport where you have family members. Baseball is another one where there's a lot of father-son duos, right? And brothers and cousins and all that playing the sport. But when you look at where F1 originates, which is in Europe, those countries are so small, relatively speaking, to the rest of the world and close-knit and tight together. And they have so many different competitions, way more per capita than I think we have in the U.S. And they see these people all the time at all these events, whether it be karting or junior league racing or Formula Feeder Series. And all these families have known each other for decades.
Right. Well, you have to understand that. Granted, it's a lot bigger in Europe, the whole racing scene and all of that, but you still have to remember it is just that. It's a niche scene. So if you're not into Formula One or you're not into racing, you're not going to know those people. So these are families that have had an interest in this for years and years. And that's why you'll see their names everywhere. You'll see, oh, he's competing in Germany. Oh, now he's competing in Europe. Oh, now he's, whatever.
Yeah, they just go from country to all the different karting competitions and things like that, seeing the same father and son duos. Okay, I heard you researching one more thing before we fired up this podcast.
I want to wrap this up.
Okay, go for it.
So I have a cool possibility that I think would be interesting to see one day. So Charles Leclerc, we both know, Formula One driver for Ferrari.
Could have potentially, according to my hot takes in episode 1, been the world drivers champion in 2022 if he had a good strategist.
Right, which is why they're called hot takes. So he actually has a younger brother, Arthur, who just got into Formula 2. Now, the crazy thing about this is that they actually had to put Arthur's career on hold because the finances were running out for the Leclerc family. And Charles, who was the more dominant one, the one who was more into it, took it further. They followed him all the way to F1. They financed the way. They did everything that they could to get him there. Once he gets to F1 and things are rolling again, Arthur resumes his career.
Yeah.
Now he's moving up. He's doing his thing. He's in Formula 2. And I think it would be insane if we could see a brother duo on the grid in F1.
I can say almost for sure that has never happened, and that would be insanely cool to have two brothers drive against each other. The only thing you'd want to avoid is maybe like the Max and Daniel situation where they both think they're the greatest of all time.
That maybe Ferrari not sign Arthur to side by side with Charles, because that could get ugly with that brotherly competitive spirit.
Yeah, you would go from having Ferraris competing for dominance to both DNFing in the race. But all right, F1 families.